Though I did not know the place, I set out for the land of my dreams. Having arrived at the land of my dreams, I found I did not know the place. For whilst I have breathed life into a dying civilization, it has blossomed among its brethren into a distant and hazy future. The mighty empire of Majorian is no more. The Romans must survive in a world unrecognizable to antiquity. Welcome to History's Influence. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to help us along our journey to 10,000 subscribers. I'd also like to give a big shout out to my patrons, Dark Age Sage and 2 Jackson and Ace. Now, onto the video. This video will be exploring how a surviving Western Roman Empire and its surroundings will fare into the medieval era. This will work as a standalone exploration, but it's also the final piece in a 3-part series, so let's briefly summarize what happened in parts 1 and 2. In part 1, we saw the Western Emperor Majorian successfully reconquer the wealthy province of Africa in 461 AD, among other lands, alongside reforming and stabilizing the empire. The empire would withdraw to Italy, Africa and Illyria, thanks primarily to the Germanic Franks and Visigoths. Later, in part 2, the Eastern Emperor Justinian could not perform his historical reconquests of the western provinces, which remained under Roman control. He instead moved to conquer the Balkans, establishing an effective defense which would keep the region Latin and Greek-speaking, causing the Slavs to instead settle within the Pannonian Basin. Later, in the 7th century, the Arab invasions still occurred, but they weren't able to conquer West Rome's province of Africa, leaving the surrounding Berbers under Roman Christian, not Arab Muslim, influence. Trading links would later be established in this stasis between the Romans and Arabs, a peaceful trading dynamic, not unlike the Roman Empire of old. Now, for this final part, we're going to dive into the cultural, economic, and religious changes that will occur as we move into the medieval era. We will then look at how these factors and more will combine to change the political and civilizational fate of Rome, Europe, and the world. But before we dive into these factors, there's an important question we should first answer. So, let's get started, shall we? Considering that both halves of the Roman Empire weathered the storm of the past 2 videos, would it be possible for them to instead take the offensive, reconquering the lands they once held, and perhaps more? The most important limiting factor in such an endeavour would be the lack of imperial succession law. The rules of who would be emperor next were never set in stone, which would often plunge the Roman and Byzantine empires into brutal civil warfare, especially during the end of a ruling dynasty. This would distract the emperor, since he would be forced to placate interest groups such as the military, bureaucracy, and even the populace of Constantinople, for example. This impacted the empires both when defense was most needed, but also when offensive opportunities arose. And even with the historical attempt of succession reform, enacted by Alexios Komnenos, this brief golden age was only followed by worsening civil strife for the rest of the Byzantines' existence. Speaking of the Byzantines, it would be worth looking at their historical example of reconquests. The most impressive reconquests we see, which occurred during the 10th and 11th centuries, reflect a weak baseline of capability for the imperial system in terms of offensive operations. They relied upon strongly favourable conditions for success. These conquests were only initiated because the powerful neighbours of the Abbasid Caliphate and Bulgarian Empire had been shattered or severely weakened. And for conquests to even occur, the opposing border needed to be secure, usually done through repeated truces. The 3 emperors most responsible for such victories were some of the best emperors of Byzantine history as well, be it Nicephorus Phocas, John Zimisces, or Basil II. And it still took decades for Basil II to complete the crowning achievement of the conquest of Bulgaria, whose empire was severely weakened by the Rus decades earlier. Talk about an open goal. Not to mention, Basil II's planned invasion of Sicily, cancelled when he died, was not successfully followed through by with his successors. His individual assertion of state control and military command were a requirement for such an endeavour. The empire itself proved incapable. And decades later, when 3 new, decentralised and unexpected enemies came to face Byzantium, the Byzantines would lose their Anatolian heartland. There was an impressive reconquest of much of Anatolia which followed, but This was only initiated by the invasion of a large Western crusading force. The Byzantine imperial model was not geared for large-scale conquest, like the Roman Republic or Empire of old. Over the centuries, Byzantium became a civilization far more suited in defense, rather than brazen conquest. This fundamental truth will be applicable in this new timeline, both to East and West Rome, surrounded by enemies who would keep them on the defensive over the centuries. But in this new timeline, the two Romes will have stronger capabilities than historical Byzantium. They would still hold defensible heartlands, but now they would have the stable recruiting ground of the Balkans, stronger naval domination, increased trade and prosperity, alongside potential assistance between the two empires helping each other out. This would suggest reconquest would be more effective. However, well-established and large powers, such as the Slavic Pannonians or the Franks in Gaul, won't be easy to conquer. These powers would also hold their own defendable geography. Provence, a more accessible region in the south of the Frankish kingdom, may be conquered from the filthy Franks in a moment of weakness, but it could easily be lost during a West Roman civil dispute. Hispania would instead be ruled by the Germanic Visigoths, slow to integrate with the population and less effective at statecraft than the Franks. They will fracture as they did historically, thanks to their inherent weaknesses in administration, despite the benefits for the Germanics we will later discuss in this video. As a result, Hispania will begin to open up to both Roman and Frankish incursions. The Byzantines made a dent historically under Justinian, but in this new timeline, the West Romans would be closer and more invested in such a reconquest. However, the intruders won't find invading Iberia a breeze. Factors will make the conquest difficult, such as the Pyrenees mountain range bordering the Franks, alongside other mountainous regions, the surrounding sea, the sheer size of Iberia, etc. The Franks and Romans would also squabble between themselves, allowing the local Iberians to possibly play them off. These factors suggest to me that independent power bases will develop to resist and later expel such incursions, although such developments are quite speculatory. Looking east, Byzantium will still be in a good position as they were historically, following the eventual collapse of the Caliphate. The Byzantines would need to make truces with the Avar Slavs in order to make effective conquests east. It's also likely the West would assist in this reconquest effort. Iberia may be far away for the Byzantines, but the Islamic threat was shared for both of the empires. The Byzantines would be capable of marching into Syria as they did historically, but I believe they would go further and conquer more, splitting the Islamic world in two. Although new powers will arise from the Middle East and its surroundings, not to mention the Avars and their successors would not be placated in perpetuity either, pouncing on any moments of weakness. And there's also the internal weaknesses we previously discussed. What I'm trying to say is that ideal circumstances for reconquest won't be permanent. So, we will assume more modest gains take place, rather than seeing a humongous Byzantine Empire. Now we've established that Rome won't reconquer its empire, how will the Roman identity in this new timeline develop, within provinces they hold or once held? For starters, the West Romans in Italy, Africa, and Illyria will still identify as Roman. The North Italians won't splinter into regional identities within city-states, for example. The Latin language within the empire would remain mutually intelligible, thanks to a unified and sophisticated administration, but this does not mean that trace differences won't exist. For example, the Gallo-Italic languages of northern Italy would still hold remnants of the region's previous Celtic languages, as it still does today. It also holds influence from the Germanic Lombards, which came later, but they wouldn't have conquered Italy in this new timeline. Moving westward, is it possible the nearby Latin speakers of Gaul and Hispania may still identify as Roman? Given that West Rome will survive, instead of merely the distant Greek-speaking East surviving? Like what happened historically, these provincial Romans won't be demographically overwhelmed by Germanics, such as what happened in Britain or Austria. We still would also have the shared Chalcedonian church the Latin speakers will worship, alongside the trading links that would be re-established over time. But ultimately, the political situation on the ground will override such concerns, eroding the Roman identity of old. Even before Majorian's reign started in 457 AD, there were autonomous Baghidae groups in Gaul and Hispania revolting against the central government. Furthermore, the Roman Senate in 455 to 456, under Emperor Avitus, a Gallic emperor, had resented foreign Gallic senators being appointed in what they considered to be an Italian aristocracy. These trends won't be changing in this new timeline, and most importantly, Germanics would still initially rule as Germanic conquerors and not be able to sustain Roman styles of administration. The central cities would decline and degrade as a result, only to be exacerbated by Justinian's plague in part 2 of this series. This would create a more regional and rural society, allowing for dialect shifts in Latin to exacerbate, for example between northern and southern France. This societal shift would also distance these peoples and their lifestyles from the Roman Empire of old, which they would have not known for centuries eventually. So, which identities in particular would these people shift to? The Franks historically most likely allowed for elite recruitment and upwards mobility for locals, in which such Romans would come to adopt the Frankish identity for themselves. This would trickle down to the rest of the population in northern Gaul, creating the French identity. Whether this was a net positive or negative for mankind though is still up for debate. The same structure will be created in this new timeline, with the same French result, and with the Occitans and the like coming into existence as well down in the south. Some of the northern elite aspirants may seek a career within Western Rome in earlier decades or perhaps centuries, but I'd expect this movement to be a small phenomenon. But what would happen in Hispania? Iberia would hold a fractured identity, as it did historically, but this would be under a disunified Visigothic nobility, rather than having language and identities forged by the northern Christian states during the Reconquista. The Visigoths took far longer than the Franks to identify with the locals, taking 200 years to even follow the same legal code historically. A vague Spanish identity would develop from their shared enemies in the Franks and Romans, but later political unification would be needed for it not to be permanently fractured or killed in the cradle. We now have a good picture of what will happen to the Latins of the West, but what about the East, which identified as Roman, albeit with a Greek-speaking majority? Let's start by discussing their relationship with the Western Empire and their own Romanness. Sharing important links with the West through trade, cultural exchange, and shared enemies such as the Arabs and Slavs will allow East and West Rome to remain on good terms consistently. They will still recognize each other as twin consuls of the Roman Empire, both old and new or West and East. But Byzantium will still eventually adopt Greek as the language of administration, despite shared ties with West Rome. This would be a pragmatic decision to aid in communications for tax collection, military orders, etc. Although interestingly, both empires will be holding Latin and Greek minorities respectively. The small Greek population of South Italy will Latinize over the centuries, given the Latin administration. But the Latin-speaking areas of the Byzantine Balkans won't assimilate to nearly the same degree, given their far larger size and being direct neighbours with their West Roman brethren. So, we now have a clear perspective on the shifting identities of the Romans in this new timeline. But what about the faith they came to follow centuries ago? How will Chalcedonian Christianity develop in this new timeline? The Chalcedonian Church historically would split into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, under Roman and Constantinopolitan leadership respectively. The Bishop of Rome's authority would increase in the West over time, eventually being granted the title of Pope. They would come to hold the supreme authority which demarcates Catholicism from Orthodoxy today. Shout out to the new Pope, Leo XIV. This was a process which took centuries to develop, that depended strongly on the secular and political situation for the Roman bishop. The Western Roman Empire granted the church autonomy historically, but later Ostrogothic and Byzantine rulers of the city of Rome would puppeteer, appoint, and depose numerous bishops. Later, as Byzantine rule weakened, the bishops would begin to assert their own authority with a secular state established with the help of the Franks. But in this new timeline, as we established in part 2, Western Rome will have their capital re-established in Rome for centuries. How would Western Christianity develop as a result, especially within Western Rome? It's important to note that this new dynamic is similar to what happened with Byzantium's secular and spiritual capital of Constantinople. Also similarly, the importance of Christianity to the states will increase over the centuries. More on that later. This will encourage the state's encroachment in religion, rather than sticking to a lighter touch like the Western Romans did historically. As a side note, this will mirror the Senate, whose independent streak in Majorian's time will be sidelined more and more as the Western Empire solidifies control in its own empire. Anyway, The dynamic in the church will lend towards Caesaropapism, which occurred in Byzantium. This was a system where the head of state held both secular and religious authority, essentially making the state supreme over the church. This religious integration will also aid in the legitimization of emperors. They will be chosen by God, rather than deified as gods like in pagan Rome. Autonomous developments will still occur within the churches, however. Take the late 6th century conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, which will now work to boost West Roman soft power, and so won't be prevented. Assuming a figure similar to Pope Gregory I initiates such an endeavour. But what of the Chalcedonian Christians in Gaul and Hispania? The Arian Christian Germanic elites of Hispania will still convert to their majority population's Chalcedonian faith, thanks to population pressure and a lack of effective missionary work. And also thanks to their heretical Christology. But I digress. Although despite adopting the Chalcedonian Christian sect, these kingdoms will eventually develop autonomous religious leadership under the Bishop of Rome's domain. You see, the Germanic kings would not appreciate West Roman interference into state affairs, with the Bishop of Rome acting as a puppet for the empire. Warfare may be necessary to win such autonomy, like the Orthodox Bulgarians successfully fighting for autonomy from Constantinople. This dynamic would weaken the strength of the Bishop of Rome, emphasizing their role as the first among equals in the Chalcedonian Church, as per the Orthodox formulation. The Western churches under Rome would become more of an association like in Orthodoxy, whose bishops would formulate judgments and policies in a stronger position relative to the Roman bishop. There's a key point we've been hammering down here, with a clear conclusion in my eyes. Without the authority and power of the Pope expanding both religiously and in a secular sense, the great schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches won't happen in this new timeline. The assertion of papal primacy won't occur in the same fashion, and so won't be met with resistance from the East. In fact, the close relationship between West and East Rome means that the Western and Eastern churches would have even further incentive to remain united. A shared Roman world could allow for shared theological controversies too, reducing the clear Latin-Greek division we saw happen historically. This doesn't mean unique developments, such as Eastern iconoclasm, won't occur to an extent though. Moving on, looking at these two societies more broadly, will West and East Rome shift into far more religiously oriented societies? This happened to the Byzantines historically, particularly after the Arab invasions initiated their Dark Age. In many ways, this shift won't be changing. Christianity only became the official Roman religion in 380 AD, not enough time for West Rome historically to take the strong Christian shift embedded in empire and society as we saw in medieval Byzantium. Furthermore, losing heretical provinces provided religious homogeneity for Byzantium, allowing for a more orthodox-oriented society generally. Byzantium will face the same shock of the Arab conquests, at least initially before their reconquests, and West Rome would be homogeneous regardless. Nevertheless, both West and East Rome would still have better conserved, even if diminished, city-based civilizations. Both the preservation of old texts and the illiteracy rate would have been better preserved as a result. Secular institutions of learning and the like would have also survived more intact, without as much city destruction, even if they will be Christianized over time. Europe wouldn't need to rely so heavily on the Dark Age Catholic Church or Byzantine Eastern monasticism to rebuild intellectual life from a more sparse baseline. Cross-pollination from the clergy will positively impact Germanic and Slavic societies over time too. The Arabs would also partake in such a system, given the trading links previously discussed. So the two Romes would hold religious societies but with more secular elements preserved. This seems more like an early modern Europe as opposed to a Dark Age Europe, doesn't it? But before we get to such complex questions of long-term development, it would be worth taking a look at West Rome's economy to see how it would shape in this new world. The size and complexity of the Western Roman economy would have been reduced by losing Gaul and Hispania centuries earlier. Nonetheless, the symbiotic economic relationship between Italy and Africa will have been restored by Majorian, and so will flourish. Africa will act as a wealthy breadbasket, providing food and other goods and services to the Italian heartland, whose demand would in turn boost the African economy, in particular with the city of Rome, like with what happened historically. For example, the output of wheel-turned pottery, amphorae, cutlery, pots, and pans will be maintained but at lower levels to their ancient peak. Historically, such a peak was only reached again during Renaissance Italy in the 1300s, so even a partial maintenance is a huge deal. High quality pot wasn't easy to come by. I mean, pots. The same broad rule applied with architecture, art, and other such advancements. Again, 1,000 years to reach the same level of complexity and quantity is a huge bloody deal. This contraction of such industries and output, as opposed to outright collapse, will have huge ramifications we will get to later. Additionally, the maintenance of coin printing in the Western Empire will ensure commercial trade is strengthened throughout the Mediterranean. Ancient buildings will also be better maintained, thanks to a precedent set by laws Majorian passed historically. These constructions would be their heritage, not the remnants of a bygone civilization after all. Reuse wouldn't be avoided completely, but we won't have the very often Renaissance usage where architects would often borrow ancient Roman marble for new constructions. And thanks to the continuation of a unified Italy under an imperial and bureaucratic state, northern and southern Italy will be more economically similar compared to how they diverged historically. The north will still be wealthier overall, however, thanks to trade opening to Europe over time, the fertile Po Valley, and the larger size of the region. The centre around Rome will still be the wealthiest region in Italy, however, being the core of an empire. Overall, a surviving West Rome seems to hold strong economic prospects, but what about the working conditions of the masses? Will slavery remain endemic as it did in Roman antiquity? Slavery reached a peak of 35% of the Roman population at around 31 BC. Slaves mostly worked in the predominant field of agriculture, but they were already being slowly replaced by coloni by the fall of Rome, who were essentially indebted workers. Factors such as mixed union marriages helped muddy the waters between the two groups, but the most important factor causing the transition would be the cost and quantity of slaves. As the Roman Empire stopped conquering outwards, large slave populations were not constantly being received, increasing the cost of slaves. This made the appeal of hiring other types of workers preferable to owning slaves. The colony shift will continue to occur, but with smaller population bases for the two Romes to pull from, making labour less disposable. The value of labour will be boosted over time by agricultural innovations they will adopt over time, likely from the Arabs and other groups. Developments such as soldier land grants in Africa, used to defend against the Arab invasions in Part 2, will help delegate power away from central authority in the West, similar to the Byzantine theme system historically, which relied on free peasants far more than slaves. Now we have a good idea of the economic situation and low-class working conditions of West Rome, let's get focused on the final big question of this alternate timeline. These geopolitical, religious, cultural, and economic developments lead us to the crescendo of this series. Will Europe still develop feudalism, followed by more and more advancements as a civilization, with a climax of global domination? The importance of the Dark Ages, and the feudal system which developed within Europe at the time, cannot be understated, in relation to Europe's long-term development historically. Firstly, the Germanics, particularly the Franks, could not centrally manage their vast realms as the Romans once could. As control reduced, cities dependent upon Roman systems had declined in population and relevance. This would allow for numerous interest groups outside of a centralized government to come to prominence. Secondly, the Germanics instead had to rely on appointing local nobles to rule small regions, as they could not be centrally managed. The descendants of these lords would inherit their positions, leading to the development of a strong nobility. You did see regionalism develop within medieval Imperial Byzantium, but regional titles were granted by the emperor directly and were not heritable. Thirdly, the peasants would strengthen in position given such population reduction and decentralization, a continuation of the old shift from slaves to coloni. Local lords couldn't replicate the authority of large-scale land magnates or imperial bureaucrats. Agricultural yields would also increase over time with innovation, further empowering the peasantry on a per capita basis. As a result, the disastrous plague of the Black Death would actually work to strengthen the peasants' bargaining power. It killed 30 to 50% of Europe, but allowed for wage growth and labour mobility. The similar plague of Justinian centuries earlier did not create such results, thanks largely to the systems of ancient Byzantium. Fourthly, the Catholic Church established itself as an independent power base, preserving much of ancient Roman and Greek civilization, which in turn provided an educational foundation for Western Europe. Such institutions and authority were largely outside the purview of individual medieval kingdoms, with exceptions in certain periods. Fifthly, is that a word? Trading links also had to be slowly re-established over time, with peaceful arrangements between disunified states, more robust than those dependent upon the centrality of Roman control against barbarian incursion. Overall, these competing internal elements of the monarchy, peasants, noblemen, influence of the Catholic Church, and merchants helped foster competition, and most crucially, this was exacerbated by constant conflict between states and peoples, which allowed for a fragmented Europe to become so robust, competitive, and innovative. Other regions of Eurasia would often come under the yoke of large empires, who would repress such advancements in favour of stable leadership, such as the Ottomans banning the printing press, or neglect to utilise inventions, like how the Chinese invented gunpowder, but weren't the ones to develop strong gunpowder weapons. Now, substantial advancements still occurred in large empires, such as with the Song dynasty of China, but they were too strongly dependent upon these individual societies, which could collapse, be conquered, or turn against such change. This happened to a severe degree with the collapse of Rome historically in Europe, leading to the Dark Ages. The Silk Road did allow for a broad element of adoption and competition throughout Eurasia, but this was nowhere near as fierce as the local competition of Europe would become. In Europe, a state could not afford to suppress new innovations, or else be outshined, weakened, or conquered by its neighbours who chose to adopt them. This will also occur in this new timeline. West Rome won't dominate Western Europe in the way the old Roman Empire did, as we discussed during the Reconquest section of the video. Instead, they would be in a similar position to Byzantium historically. They will still work to stifle developments which may threaten the emperor's power, challenge religious orthodoxy, etc. More restrictive cultural flourishing will occur, like the state-funded renaissances of Byzantium, the Macedonian and Paleologan renaissances, for example. In this new timeline, you would have Western Rome, Byzantium, and the Islamic Caliphate following such a model. The Byzantines would also have a reduced Dark Age with their larger size and economy. This suggests a more limited framework of competition compared to the European world we described, but further vitality may be found in the rest of Europe. The Germanic barbarians of old consisted of mobile tribal units, not settled peoples like the Romans. Historically, they would come to shape not only Germanic Christendom, but feudal Europe as a whole. How will the kingdoms develop in this new timeline, delayed by 50 years but still coming to fruition? Gaul and Hispania would be ravaged from barbarian raids and eventual occupation, reducing their populations and weakening local administration. This would be further dragged out for decades longer than what happened historically. The Germanics in this new timeline still won't be accustomed to maintaining such a complex system. We will still see economic output and population reduced drastically, worsened by the disruption of trading ties with Italy and the like. From the ashes, Germanic nobles under the leadership of kings will still be able to initially establish their power bases, rather than being subservient to a sophisticated, city-based imperial administration. Makeshift castles will be constructed to defend local lands and subjects. A castle-based society, not a city one necessarily, will still begin to form. This will also strengthen the position of local peasants over time due to the local lord's reliance upon them. However, a higher technological and educational floor for the Germanics would be established, thanks to contact with an intact Western Rome and the rest of the Mediterranean world. Numerous pieces of technology, culture, philosophy, and governmental systems will be maintained, but the exact technologies will be difficult to know, and dependent upon the context of Majorian's revival we described in part 1. The last Roman aqueduct, for example, was constructed in 368 in Constantinople. It's unlikely such constructions would continue again, given that Majorian started reigning in 457. Regardless, the Germanics will still develop literacy, currency-based economies, and more complex institutions far earlier than they did historically. The development of cities would take quicker than they did historically, but will be slow in pace, given the societal developments we just recently discussed. A further point in favour of rapid development would be the strong commercial trade in the Mediterranean, which the Germanics will eventually integrate into, alongside other neighbouring peoples. This could help create a powerful merchant class, earlier than what happened historically. Although such benefits in this new timeline will come packaged with drawbacks. The Catholic Church wouldn't be an independent power base throughout Europe anymore. Instead of restoring education in Western Europe, basically on their lonesome, through the preservation of texts and the like, Germanic contact with West Rome and the broader Mediterranean world will allow such advancements to be adopted from actual Roman sources, preserving such materials to a larger extent by direct continuation. So, without advocacy from a strong autonomous papacy, the faster centralizing states of Europe would still be able to challenge and stifle the Church more than they had historically. Remember that they will receive autonomy from the Bishop of Rome, as we discussed in the religious section. For example, there won't be an investiture controversy, where the Holy Roman Empire fought with the Pope over the ability to appoint abbots. This doesn't mean the Church won't hold any independent power, however, especially through the establishment of monasteries and cathedrals. These would serve as early footholds in initially underdeveloped Germanic states. Additionally, secular institutions would have also been better maintained, aiding the Church in further challenging governmental dominance on culture and education. And most importantly, the individual contexts of different regions within Europe will allow for more or less subversion across the continent, be it state domination, church domination, etc. So, overall, the factors we've discussed suggest that Europe will still be in a really strong position after a period of darkness. They would maintain many of the fundamental structures which allowed them to truly prosper 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. In fact, they would be given a large head start in this new timeline. This will especially be the case as civilizational and Christian frontiers expand past the Roman and Germanic frontiers. This wouldn't be exclusive to Europe either. North Africa will be part of this milieu as well. As opposed to taking part in Arab-style piracy and the West African slave trade, like they did historically, they'd be an outpost of a Christian, Romanized society, yet still a Berber-speaking people. With the large reduction of slavery in the European world, and without the Arabs establishing such a trade in the Maghreb, West Africa's slave trade would not be initiated as a result. Perhaps they'd be Christianized through the Sahel Desert. On the topic of Christianity, as we've discussed before, the Chalcedonian Church will remain united, but more autonomous and even autocephalous in regions. This means the Protestant Reformation against the centralized Catholic Church, which held corrupting secular power, won't be mirrored in this new timeline. Although, whilst I'd assert this broad pattern of unity, we've gone so far into this new timeline we can't know for certain. After all, schisms and new developments are a repeating feature of Christianity in its history. Perhaps faraway schisms may come to prominence. You will also see differing influences depending on the Roman or Constantinopolitan influence on different regions, helping provide diversity and differentiation within the Church. These broad changes have been important, but what about the fate of particular nations? For example, the Eastern and Western Roman Empires. Numerous benefits, many of which we've discussed throughout this video series, suggest that the two Romes will actually survive. Unless the Byzantine Empire happens to be crippled by an opponent like the Seljuk Turks, originating from the Eurasian steppe, which may lead to their eventual collapse, and possibly the loss of the Balkans for West Rome too. West Rome though would fare far better with less and more consistent neighbours to deal with, normalising relations over time with such opponents. Its distance from migratory peoples would strongly aid in their preservation. The empire will last a long time, perhaps to the modern day. Additionally, its cultural homogeneity will aid in expelling any potential occupations. This would prevent the Frankish conquest of Italy from occurring. Both powers would also be expelled from Iberia, as we discussed earlier in the video. Iberian unity will eventually occur as a result. The Franks would also be challenged by a more powerful Slavic advance, as mentioned in part 2. These Slavic groups would eventually coalesce into states of their own as well. The Franks were the most effective state in Dark Age Europe historically, ignoring Byzantium, but in this new timeline they could also receive key influences from West Rome, both technologically and administratively, without the subdividing between sons as was famous with their rule. Perhaps an emperorship title could be confirmed, as the Byzantines gave to the Bulgarians after a nasty defeat historically. However, I believe the kingdom will fracture before this is able to happen, given its sheer size, and the development of local noble power which will still occur. The kingdom will divide upon French and German cultural lines, thanks largely to their local leadership, with these two kingdoms fighting each other for lands lost, just as often as they would fight their other neighbours. Although these would be far more centralised and advanced states than what we saw in the Frankish split historically. West Francia, later known as France, took centuries to do so in our own timeline, and East Francia, later being the core part of the Holy Roman Empire, would be fractured for centuries in our own timeline. Looking at Europe as a whole, its exact fate would be uncertain, as political dynamics could be shifted by any number of new nations, peoples, empires, steppe warriors to the east, etc. There would be no Germanic Holy Roman Empire, no crusades initiated by a Catholic Pope, no Muslim Moors to reconquer land from in Iberia, etc. But as we mentioned before, with the technological head start and the competitive nature of the continent remaining, I'd expect Europe to be more societally advanced by centuries. Historic inventions would happen much sooner. For an early example, the mid to late medieval era saw huge advancements in agriculture through the wheeled plough and windmills. Assuming an earlier invention of such things in this new timeline, we would see faster population growth and a strengthened position for the peasantry per capita in an earlier period. A renaissance would be replaced by a better preserved Greek and Roman pagan tradition. Its development of a strong humanistic emphasis would come to be invented outside of Imperial Italy, however. We can't hurt the emperor's feelings after all. Factors such as colonialism and industrialization require continuous innovation, which is likely to occur with the framework we've provided, and will of course transform the rest of the world. Nations on the Atlantic coast would be more prone to colonize initially, thanks to simple geography and sailing experience. We would also expect the Christianized North Africa to get involved. Like with other developments we've discussed in Europe, this would weaken the position of the Romans, shifting power to the Atlantic and other regions rather than the Mediterranean. Looking outside of Europe, the Middle East would certainly have been impacted by a smaller Islamic caliphate, although the exact powers who would come out of the region would be unpredictable. But we do know that the Middle East, alongside the rest of the world, will eventually feel the weight of European expansion. Anyway, any further speculation would be futile. We've gone far enough as it is. So, we'll be leaving it there for this video series. Look at this supercharged world we've created, thanks to an eternal flame which refused to be put out. The glory of Rome is eternal after all. I hope you all enjoyed this video. It was incredibly challenging and overwhelming to make. Don't feel bad if you're overwhelmed watching it. I felt overwhelmed watching it and I'm the guy who made it. I'll see how I can strike a better balance in future videos. Anyway, this has been History's Influence. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe. Catch you later.